Chapter 1. A Strange Intruder. The wind howled softly through the evergreens as Caleb Grant trudged up the narrow path, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He adjusted the straps of his heavy pack, a familiar ache spreading across his shoulders, but he didn't mind. The mountains were his escape, a silent, unchanging world untouched by time or the weight of city life. It had been 2 years since he last set foot at his grandfather's old mountain cabin. He could already picture it in his mind. The weathered logs, the stone chimney leaning ever so slightly, the little porch that creaked when you stepped on it. A part of him expected it to look exactly the same, though the woods had a way of reclaiming what was left behind. "This is going to be good for you," Caleb muttered to himself, breaking the quiet. Fresh air. No people, no distractions. The city had worn him down. Work stress, relationship failures, and the gnawing emptiness of a life surrounded by noise but devoid of meaning had left him yearning for solitude. The mountains were his place of renewal, and his grandfather's cabin isolated in a remote valley was a refuge. He'd inherited it after the old man passed, though he rarely made the trip. Now, though, it called to him. As the last light of day filtered through the trees, Caleb rounded the final bend. There it was, the cabin, perched on the edge of a clearing, framed against a backdrop of towering pines and distant peaks. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from the stone chimney, pale against the twilight sky. Caleb froze mid-step. Smoke? His heart thudded in his chest. The cabin should have been empty. No one had been up here in years, and he hadn't told anyone he was coming. He tightened his grip on the strap of his pack, instincts kicking in. Someone or something was inside his cabin. The thought made his skin prickle. "Calm down," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Probably squatters, or hunters who needed shelter. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Who would be up here? The valley was miles from civilization, inaccessible without days of hiking or a skilled climb. The few hunters who knew about the cabin wouldn't dare trespass, they'd respect the boundaries. Caleb moved carefully now, his footsteps softer as he approached. The familiar creak of the front porch under his boot felt louder than usual, the sound cutting through the stillness. He reached the door, his pulse quickening as he noticed faint scratches around the handle. Not human made, something sharper. He tested the doorknob. Unlocked. A chill ran down his spine. He pushed the door open, his other hand instinctively slipping into his jacket to rest on the handle of the hunting knife strapped to his chest. The door swung inward with a low groan. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, illuminated only by the orange glow of the fire crackling in the stone hearth. Caleb scanned the room quickly, his eyes darting from the small wooden table to the worn armchair, then to the darkened hallway leading to the bedroom. Everything looked familiar, a little dustier than he remembered, but untouched in a way that suggested no one had disturbed it in years. And yet the fire. Fresh logs sat neatly stacked beside it, and the air smelled faintly of pine smoke and something else. Something sharp and metallic. Caleb set his pack down silently by the door. "Hello?" His voice felt too loud in the quiet. No one answered. He stepped further into the room, the hairs on his neck standing on end as his eyes scanned every shadow. He could feel it, he wasn't alone. From somewhere deeper in the cabin, there was a faint sound. A shuffle. Caleb spun toward the noise, his hand tightening on his knife. "Who's there?" Nothing. The sound had come from the bedroom. Caleb's heart pounded as he stepped carefully across the creaking floorboards. He pushed the door open with his boot and peered inside. The bed was unmade, as though someone had been sleeping there. The blankets were rumpled, and a faint indentation in the pillow made his stomach twist. His gaze traveled to the window, where the faint outline of fingertips slightly smudged and clawed were visible in the frost. But the room was empty. "I'm losing it," Caleb muttered, running a hand through his hair. Long hike, empty stomach. "It's nothing." He turned back toward the living room and froze. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows near the kitchen, something moved. Caleb's breath caught. He didn't see a clear shape, but there was no doubt something was there. A faint silhouette, crouched low against the wall, just beyond the fire's reach. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to hold still. "Hey," he said cautiously, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to hurt you. If you're just looking for shelter, it's okay." The figure didn't move. Caleb took a step closer, knife still ready at his side. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, the shape began to resolve into something unfamiliar. It was a person, no, not quite. Her skin, though pale, seemed to shimmer faintly, as though tiny veins of light pulsed beneath the surface. Her hair was long and white, falling like liquid silk over her face as she pressed herself against the wall. Her hands, tipped with faintly clawed fingertips, were wrapped tightly around her knees, and her eyes when she lifted her head to look at him were wide and luminescent, glowing faintly like twin stars. Caleb stumbled back, his mind reeling. What are you? The woman flinched at his voice, retreating further into the shadows. She looked terrified, her chest rising and falling quickly as though she couldn't decide whether to flee or fight. Caleb's fear was momentarily overshadowed by something else. Confusion, then instinctive empathy. Whoever or whatever she wasn't attacking him. She was hiding. Caleb took a slow breath, lowering the knife slightly. "It's okay," he said gently, keeping his voice low. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman didn't reply. She just stared at him, her glowing eyes unblinking, her body trembling faintly. Caleb didn't move closer, but he kept talking, hoping his tone might soothe her. "This cabin's mine. I didn't know anyone was here. You need help?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, only a faint, melodic sound, like a hum vibrating through the air. It wasn't human. Caleb blinked, unsure what to do. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to run back down the mountain and pretend he hadn't seen her. But he couldn't tear his eyes away. What was she? Before he could say anything else, the woman moved. Quick as a shadow, she darted toward the hallway, disappearing into the darkness of the bedroom. Caleb flinched but didn't follow. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood alone in the firelit room, the weight of what he'd just seen sinking in. He wasn't alone in the cabin. Chapter 2. Echoes of Another World. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Caleb sat on the edge of the worn armchair, his knife still gripped loosely in his hand. His breathing had steadied, but his mind was anything but calm. He glanced down the dark hallway, where the strange woman had disappeared. The room beyond was silent, no footsteps, no whispers. What in God's name did I just see? Her glowing eyes were burned into his mind, wide and terrified, the way a wild animal might look at a predator. But there had been something human about her too, her face, her expression, the way she shrank back from him in fear. Whoever, or whatever, she wasn't trying to hurt him. Caleb ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. "Okay, Grant, think this through." Part of him wanted to pack up and leave the cabin immediately, trek back down the mountain and never look back. But another part, the part that loved unraveling puzzles and chasing answers, refused to let it go. Someone else was in his cabin, someone who clearly wasn't normal, and he wasn't the kind of man to run from that. A gust of wind rattled the cabin's old windows, and Caleb stood slowly. He didn't want to spook her further, but he also couldn't just leave her hiding back there. Setting the knife on the table, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace and moved toward the bedroom. "Hey," he said softly as he reached the threshold. "I'm coming in, okay? I'm not gonna hurt you, I promise." Silence. The room was darker now. A thin slice of moonlight filtered through the frost-covered window, casting faint silver lines across the wooden floorboards. The bed was empty, the blankets left in disarray. Caleb stepped further in, scanning the small room, his pulse quickening. Where? Then he noticed at the closet door, left slightly ajar. A faint hum echoed from inside, like a current of energy vibrating through the air. Caleb swallowed and moved closer. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not your enemy," he said carefully. "If you're scared, just talk to me. I can help." He reached out and pulled the door open. The woman was there, crouched low in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her silver-white hair spilled over her shoulders, shimmering faintly in the dark, and her glowing eyes snapped up to meet his. Caleb froze, holding his breath. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, very softly, she spoke. Human. The voice startled him not because it was threatening, but because it was soft, melodic, and sad. Her accent was strange, like a ripple of tones that didn't quite match any language he'd ever heard. "You speak English?" Caleb managed. The woman blinked, tilting her head slightly, as if confused. She tried again, her lips forming the word more clearly this time. Human. Yeah, Caleb said, nodding cautiously. I'm a human. Caleb. He pointed to himself. Caleb. Her glowing eyes studied him, flickering faintly. She pointed at him with one delicate, claw-tipped finger and echoed softly, Caleb. Something about the way she said his name sent a chill through him, not fear, but a sense that this moment was far bigger than it seemed. What? Are you? He asked gently, crouching so he was closer to her level. Are you lost? Hurt? She didn't respond right away. Her gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers curling slightly as if she were ashamed. Caleb could see the faint glow beneath her skin pulsing like veins of light, and he realized she wasn't cold. Her body radiated a gentle warmth. I am. Allery, she said finally, her voice like a whispering breeze. Allery, Caleb repeated, testing the word. It sounded alien, elegant, and unearthly. He glanced at her hands again, at the strange glow beneath her skin. You're not from here, are you? Her eyes flicked up to meet his again, and the glow in them brightened faintly. She hesitated before shaking her head. No, not here. Caleb exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He'd seen enough sci-fi movies to know what this was pointing toward. An alien, a literal extraterrestrial being, crouched in the closet of his grandfather's mountain cabin. The thought should have terrified him, but looking at her, at the way she clung to herself like a frightened child, he felt only curiosity and an inexplicable need to protect her. What happened to you? He asked softly. How did you get here? Allery flinched at the question, her glowing eyes clouding with something like pain. Crash. Falling. Fire. Her words were fragmented, but Caleb understood. You crashed, he said. Like a ship? A spacecraft? She nodded faintly, her hands trembling as she spoke. Broken. I am. Broken. Caleb frowned, his chest tightening at the way her voice cracked. She sounded so lost, so alone. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to wrap his head around it. A living, sentient being, a person, had crashed on Earth and ended up in his cabin. And she was hiding. From him. Or from something else. Are you hurt? He asked carefully, glancing at her body. Injured? Allery shook her head, though she still looked weak. Not body. Broken. Inside. She touched her chest lightly, as if gesturing towards something deeper. Caleb didn't understand, but before he could ask, Allery stiffened suddenly. Her eyes snapped toward the window, the glow intensifying. Her body tensed, her posture shifting into something predatory and alert. What is it? Caleb whispered, turning toward the window. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters against the glass. But beyond the howling wind, Caleb heard something else, a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant engine. Allery's voice dropped to a fearful whisper. They come. Caleb's blood went cold. Who? Who's coming? Allery turned to him, her glowing eyes wide with panic. Hunters. The sky watches. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the cabin walls. Caleb darted toward the window and peered out into the dark. At first, he saw nothing but the swaying of snow-laden trees, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlit sky. Then he saw a faint light moving through the forest, weaving between the trees. It wasn't a flashlight or a lantern. It was too precise, too deliberate. A beam of pale blue light scanned the forest floor, cutting through the darkness as it drew closer. Shit, Caleb whispered. Allery rose from the closet, her movements suddenly graceful and fluid despite her fear. They will find me. I must go. Go where? Caleb turned to her, his voice edged with urgency. You'll freeze out there. She shook her head, stepping back into the shadows. Safer than here. They cannot take me. Caleb looked at her, at the terror in her eyes and the way her body flickered faintly with light. He didn't know who or what these hunters were, but every instinct told him they weren't friendly. No, he said firmly. You're not running out there alone. If they want you, they'll have to go through me first. Allery stared at him, stunned into silence. You protect me? Caleb grabbed the hunting rifle his grandfather had left behind, checking that it was loaded. He glanced at her, determination burning in his eyes. Yeah, I protect you. From outside, the hum grew louder, and the pale blue light swept across the clearing, illuminating the snow like a frozen sea. Shadows moved between the trees' tall figures, deliberate and searching. "Stay low," Caleb whispered, stepping toward the window. "And don't make a sound." Allery retreated into the corner, her glowing eyes fixed on him as he took position, the rifle aimed at the door. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest, but his grip was steady. Whoever these hunters were, they'd picked the wrong mountain cabin. The hum stopped, the light vanished, and then a loud thud sounded against the cabin door. Chapter 3: The Hunters. The thud against the cabin door reverberated through the room, rattling Caleb's bones. He gripped the rifle tighter, his palms slick with sweat. The fire in the hearth flickered, throwing their shadows against the walls. "Caleb." Allery's soft whisper drew his gaze. She stood motionless in the corner, her glowing eyes fixed on the door, her entire body tensed like a bowstring. The veins of light beneath her pale skin pulsed erratically, almost as though she were panicking. "Stay down," Caleb said quietly, his voice low but firm. "They're not getting through me." Another thud, louder this time, sent a shiver through the cabin. The sound wasn't like a human knocking. It was heavier, deliberate, like something large and unnatural testing the door. Caleb edged closer, his boots silent on the creaking wooden floor, the rifle leveled and ready. "Whoever you are," Caleb shouted, "this is private property. Turn around now." Silence. Then a voice. It was faint and distorted, as though it were being filtered through an old speaker. "Surrender the anomaly, and we will not harm you." Caleb's heart skipped. The anomaly? He glanced back at Allery, whose glowing eyes were wide with terror. "Don't listen," she whispered urgently. "They are not human." "I figured that," Caleb muttered under his breath. The door shuddered again, the hinges groaning as whatever was outside applied pressure. Caleb saw the faint outline of a shadow moving past the frosted window, tall, broad, and wrong. The distorted voice returned, louder this time. "Your cooperation will ensure your survival, human. Resist, and you will be terminated." "Yeah," Caleb growled, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You're gonna have to try harder than that." Suddenly crack. The door splintered as something heavy struck it. Caleb flinched but held his ground, raising the rifle and aiming for the doorframe. His breathing slowed, instincts honed from years of hunting with his grandfather taking over. "Get ready," he muttered. A terrible sight. The door burst inward with a sound like thunder, shards of wood flying into the room. Caleb squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the shot echoing through the cabin. The figure in the doorway staggered back. It wasn't entirely humanoid, tall and skeletal, with elongated limbs and skin the color of old, dead bark. Its face was smooth, its features nothing but a faint indentation where eyes should be, glowing faintly with the same blue hue as the lights Caleb had seen outside. It let out a guttural hiss, stumbling as a black ichor oozed from the wound Caleb had torn through its shoulder. Caleb's chest heaved, adrenaline pumping through him. "Back off," he roared. The creature straightened slowly, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying him. It stepped into the room, its movements jerky yet deliberate. Behind it, Caleb saw two more figures waiting in the snow, their silhouettes massive and wrong. "Your weapons are ineffective," the distorted voice declared from the creature. Caleb couldn't tell if it was speaking or if the sound simply emerged from somewhere deep within its chest. "Oh, we'll see about that," Caleb muttered. The creature lunged forward suddenly, its long fingers reaching for him like claws. Caleb fired again, aiming low this time. The shot tore through one of its legs, dropping it to a knee with a sharp screech. "Caleb!" Allery's voice rang out, high with alarm. He glanced back just in time to see the other two creatures moving into the cabin, their glowing eyes fixed on Allery, who was backed into the farthest corner of the room. The pulsing light beneath her skin flared brighter, her breathing ragged. "No!" Caleb shouted. He dropped the rifle. It was too slow and reached for his hunting knife. With a yell, he threw himself at the closest creature. The knife plunged deep into its torso, and a horrible screech erupted as black ichor sprayed across the wooden floor. The creature convulsed violently, its clawed hands swiping at him. Caleb ducked, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have crushed his skull, and yanked the knife free before stabbing it again this time, where its neck should have been. The thing collapsed with a rattling shudder. Caleb turned to the second creature, panting hard, just in time to see Allery raise her hands. "Stay back," she cried. A wave of light exploded from her body, so bright Caleb had to shield his eyes. The creature froze mid-step, its form quivering as though trapped in invisible chains. Glowing cracks spiderwebbed across its chest, spreading outward like veins of fire. The creature let out a final shriek before shattering into dust. Caleb blinked, stunned. What the hell? Allery sagged against the wall, her light dimming, her body trembling with exhaustion. Caleb rushed to her side, catching her before she collapsed completely. Hey, stay with me," he said softly, lowering her onto the floor. "What was that? What did you do?" She shook her head weakly, her glowing eyes flickering. "I used what little remains. My energy." Caleb looked back at the door, where the first creature's body still twitched faintly, its wounds oozing black liquid. Outside, the pale blue light had faded, leaving only darkness. "They'll come back," Allery whispered, clutching his arm. "They will not stop until they take me." Caleb stared down at her, his jaw tightening. He didn't understand everything that was happening, who these creatures were, why they were after Allery, or what she even was, but none of that mattered right now. "They'll have to go through me first," he said firmly. Allery's eyes widened slightly, as though surprised. "Why? You owe me nothing." Caleb exhaled sharply. "Because you don't deserve this. And because I'm not about to let a bunch of interstellar freaks tear apart my family's cabin." A faint smile touched her lips, barely there, but real. "You are strange, Caleb," he snorted softly, brushing the hair from her face. "Takes one to know one, lady." Preparing for war. Caleb helped Allery to the armchair, draping one of the heavy blankets around her. The glow beneath her skin had dimmed, but she was stable, her breathing evening out. He turned his attention to the door and the destroyed remnants of his cabin's entrance. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They'll come back with more of them." Allery nodded faintly. "Yes, I can sense their signals. They will not stop." Caleb glanced out into the dark forest beyond the broken door. If these things hunters were after Allery, there had to be a reason. Maybe something to do with the crash she'd mentioned. Maybe they were the ones who brought her down in the first place. Either way, they had the numbers, and Caleb had a dwindling supply of ammo. "We'll head for the old mine," Caleb said, his mind racing. "It's about a mile north of here. It's deep, and there's only one way in or out. We can hold them off there." Allery looked at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "You would risk this for me?" Caleb tightened his grip on the hunting knife and gave her a small, determined smile. "You're not the only one who can fight back. Come on. If we're lucky, we can disappear before they regroup." The hum of engines rumbled faintly in the distance, growing louder. Time was running out. Caleb grabbed his pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and reached for Allery's hand. "Let's move." Chapter 4. The Last Stand. The cold air bit at Caleb's face as he led Allery through the dense, moonlit forest. The rhythmic hum of the alien hunter's engines echoed faintly behind them, growing louder. Each pulse of sound made Caleb's grip on Allery's hand tighten as they pushed through the snow-dusted underbrush. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're close now." Allery stumbled slightly, her pale skin shimmering faintly in the moonlight. The glow beneath her flesh had dimmed, and she looked drained. She hadn't said much since they left the cabin, but her trembling hand in his told him enough. She was weak. Whatever energy she had used to destroy the last hunter had cost her dearly. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice soft and musical even in its exhaustion, "you should leave me." Caleb stopped short, spinning to face her. "Not happening." His breath fogged in the freezing air. "We both get out of this, or neither of us does." She shook her head faintly, her glowing eyes filled with something he didn't want to see: resignation. "They want me, not you. If you leave, you can survive." He crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "Listen to me. You're not alone anymore, okay? I'm not running, and I'm sure as hell not leaving you to them." Her glowing eyes flickered, and for a second, her hand squeezed his in silent gratitude. Then, faintly, she whispered, "Thank you. Save it for when we're alive and kicking back at the cabin," he replied, forcing a grin. "Now come on." The mine. The entrance to the old mine loomed ahead, a yawning black mouth in the side of the mountain. Caleb's grandfather had told him stories about this placid abandoned silver mine from the early 1900s, long since left to rot. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. Caleb ushered Allery inside, glancing over his shoulder as the distant blue lights began to break through the trees. The hunters were close. "Stay quiet," he whispered as they entered the mine. The interior was colder than the forest, the stone walls slick with moisture. Caleb dug through his pack, pulling out an old flashlight. Its beam flickered weakly, illuminating the narrow tunnel. He helped Allery settle against the wall, wrapping her in another blanket. "I need you to stay put, all right?" Caleb whispered. "I'll find a way to hold them off." Allery looked at him, her glowing eyes dim but steady. "You cannot fight them alone." Caleb smiled faintly. "I don't plan to fight fair." He turned and moved further into the mine, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tunnels were deep, twisting through the mountain like veins. Caleb's boots echoed softly on the stone floor as he moved, his mind racing. "Think, Caleb, think." The hunters were stronger, faster, and armed with technology he couldn't even begin to understand. But Caleb had one advantage: they didn't know this place. And in a mine, with only one entrance and plenty of old, unstable rock overhead, he might just have a shot. The trap. Caleb worked quickly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. He found an old storage area tucked deeper in the mine, filled with rusted tools, cracked wooden crates, and dusty sticks of dynamite. He stared at the explosives for a long moment, the weight of what he was planning settling in his chest. It was risky hell, it was downright insane, but it was all he had. He rigged a makeshift trap at the entrance to the mine, using what little dynamite remained intact. The fuse was too short for comfort, but it would have to do. "Old man, I hope you know what I'm doing," Caleb muttered to himself, tying off the last of the detonator cords. The faint hum of the hunter's engines drew closer, vibrating through the ground like the approach of thunder. Caleb grabbed his rifle and sprinted back to Allery's side. "They're coming," he said breathlessly, crouching down next to her. "When I say run, you run. No questions." Allery looked at him, her face pale and drawn. "Caleb dash. Trust me," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. "I've got a plan." The hunters close in. The hum of the engines stopped abruptly. Caleb's stomach tightened. The hunters were here. The faint glow of their lights filled the tunnel, growing brighter with every step. Caleb could see their dark silhouettes moving slowly, deliberately. They were cautious now, aware that their prey was not as helpless as they had believed. Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding. "Stay back," he whispered to Allery. The first hunter stepped into view, its smooth, alien form framed by pale blue light. Its head tilted, as if scanning the darkness. "Human, you will not survive this." Caleb grinned tightly. "Want a bet?" He squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the shot echoing through the tunnel. The bullet struck the lead hunter, staggering it, but not stopping it. Behind it, the others moved forward, their glowing eyes like cold stars. "Now!" Caleb roared. He grabbed Allery's hand and pulled her to her feet, sprinting deeper into the mine. Behind them, the hunters advanced, their footsteps heavy and relentless. The fuse Caleb had set burned quickly, sparks dancing along the ground. "Faster!" Caleb shouted, his lungs burning. The tunnel rumbled beneath their feet as the dynamite detonated. A deafening boom filled the air, followed by a collapse of stone and earth. Dust and debris choked the tunnel as the entrance caved in, burying the hunters under tons of rock. Caleb skidded to a stop, coughing violently as the dust settled. Allery clung to his arm, her glowing eyes wide in the dim light. "Did it work?" she whispered. Caleb turned, staring at the mountain of rubble that now blocked the entrance. No lights, no hum, nothing but silence. "Yeah," Caleb said softly, sinking to his knees. "I think it did." Hope in the dark. Hours passed in the mine. Caleb had found an old lantern that still worked, its warm light casting shadows on the stone walls. He sat across from Allery, who looked stronger now, though her light remained faint. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "They will send more." Caleb nodded. "I figured. But we'll be ready." "You risked your life for me?" Allery whispered, looking at him with something like wonder. "Why?" Caleb shrugged, his voice soft. "Because you're not some monster like they think. You're just you. And you don't deserve to be hunted like that." Her glowing eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something in them: trust, gratitude, maybe even hope. "I was not meant to survive the crash," she admitted. "I was a mistake to them, a failure. That is why they hunt me." Caleb frowned, anger flaring in his chest. "Well, they'll have to get through me first." Allery's lips curved into a faint smile. "You are strange, Caleb Grant. Brave, foolish, kind." Caleb chuckled, leaning back against the wall. "You're not the first person to say that." Outside the mine, the wind howled through the forest, but Caleb didn't hear the hum of engines anymore. For now, they were safe. "What happens now?" Allery asked softly. Caleb looked at her, his jaw set with determination. "We get you strong. We figure out a way to send those bastards running. And if they come back, we show them why they should never mess with Earth." Epilogue. Days later, Caleb stood outside the mine's entrance, watching the sun rise over the snow-draped mountains. Beside him, Allery stood tall, her strength returning. The veins of light beneath her skin glowed brighter now, steady and calm. "Where will we go?" she asked. Caleb smirked, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Well, I've got a cabin. It's a fixer-upper, but I think you'll like it." Allery smiled softly. "Then lead the way, Caleb." Together, they turned toward the woods, the rising sun bathing the mountains in gold. The hunters would come again, Caleb knew that. But when they did, they'd find two souls ready to fight. And Caleb had no intention of letting them win.